Hi and welcome back to another video. My name is Candace and I make sewing patterns and sewing videos. And today's video is a sew along for one of my newest sewing patterns. They're called the sourdough set. So there's a sourdough top and sourdough pants, and they're the perfect patterns if you're brand new to sewing. So I wanted to design patterns that were specifically beginner friendly, but also had a lot of options and would teach you a lot of the basic skills that you need to know to sew your own clothes. And my goal when I was designing these patterns and creating the instruction booklets was to make something that was super comprehensive and would like hold your hand and walk you through everything. Because I know when I started, I kind of dabbled in self-drafting and following YouTube tutorials. And the first pattern I ever sewed was actually a pair of trousers with pleats and a waistband and an invisible zipper and darts and pockets. It was very overwhelming for me. So I wanted to design patterns that were much less intimidating and easy to make, but also cute, comfortable, stylish, and just classic pieces. This video is a sew along for the top, and I'm actually wearing it today. This is view C of the top, and there are 4 views. The neckline on all of them is the same. So they all have this high boat neck. None of them have any closures, no zippers, buttons, or anything like that. So very beginner friendly. View A has drawstring ties at the waist, and view B has elastic in the waist instead. And then view C and D are this top that I'm wearing, and they have a slightly swung out side seam. So they're a little bit more boxy and A-line than A and B. So you have lots of different options, and there are also tons of basic garment techniques that you'll learn with sewing this one pattern. Once you've sewn this, you will learn how to sew a facing, how to sew armhole binding, how to sew darts, and how to sew hem facings. This pattern is designed for woven fabric, so lightweight to medium weight. I wouldn't suggest going over 6 ounces, or I think that's 170 GSM. I'm not totally sure. I'll put it up here. View A and B are kind of more suited to lightweight fabrics because of the drawstring, and view C and D you can go a little bit heavier, but not too heavy, because it can end up feeling very stiff and the neckline could gape and things like that. The only notions you'll need for this project are lightweight interfacing, matching thread, and if you decide not to make your own bias tape, you can use store-bought bias tape. That's the only other notion that you'll need. If you've never used a PDF pattern before, there are a lot of things to know and it can feel a little overwhelming. So I actually have a video all about how to read and use sewing patterns, which I will link up here, and you can watch that before watching this one if you've never made a garment before or never used a PDF pattern, and it will walk you through how to use one. This pattern comes with print at home files, A0 file, projector file, and an instruction booklet. Since that video goes over how to use the files and how to tile the pattern together, I won't get into that in this video. I have all my pieces cut out and we will just get started. So I'm going to be making view C and also view A just to show you the different techniques. And I'm using this lightweight denim that I got from GK Fashion Fabrics, and it is probably about 6 ounces, I think, but I have all my pieces cut out and marked, and we'll get started. These are all my pieces cut out. Here we have the front, the back, and there are 1 of each, and they are mirrored. And then we have our 2 hem bands, 1 for the front and 1 for the back. And it's hard to see, I have my notches marked here. The hem bands both have notches, which match up with notches on the top. So the back has 2 notches and the front has 1 notch. And that's also like a basic pattern making thing. Back pieces always have 2 notches, front pieces always have 1. And then I have my neckline facing pieces, 1 for the front and 1 for the back. I am not going to interface these pieces because this is a little bit more structured of a fabric, but if I was using something really lightweight, I would use lightweight interfacing. The last 2 pieces you'll need are 2 armhole binding pieces, and these are bias tape pieces, and they are cut on the bias so that they are a little bit stretchy and can curve with the armhole. So the first step is to sew the fronts together and the backs together at the center front seam. So here I'm laying my 2 front pieces right sides together. I'm going to sew this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then finish the raw edge with my serger, and then I will repeat that for my back piece. Here's what your front will look like, and now we're just going to repeat this for the back. Here we have both pieces sewn with the edges finished, and now we're just going to press the seam allowance to one side. Next, we're going to stay stitch the necklines and armholes. I like to do it from the outside edges to the center for the neckline, and then for the armhole, we'll just go down the sides. And I'm turning my stitch length down to 1.8. Next, I'm just marking in the legs of my dart, and I'm using a fabric marker on the wrong side of my fabric. Then we'll bring the dart legs together, right sides together, and I like to put pins vertically and then fold the dart in half and pin again, and that just ensures that you pin directly along the legs. We'll sew from the raw edge towards the dart point. And I'm just lowering my stitch length as I get closer to the end and curving slightly. Then leave long thread tails at the end to tie a knot. After finishing the darts, you should finish the shoulder seams and side seams with a zigzag or a serger, but I forgot, so I did this later. And next, we're just going to sew our front and back pieces together at the shoulder and the side seams. So we'll just line them up and pin and sew here and here with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then we'll also finish with our serger or a zigzag stitch. All right, I love this pattern because it is so fast to sew, but at this point, this is what your top is going to be looking like. This is a good point to try it on to see if you want to make any fit changes. If it's a little bit too wide at the neckline, it's really easy to take in, even if you haven't done a fit adjustment, because there is this center front seam. So you can sew this at a larger seam allowance if you find that the neckline is too wide on you. And it's also intended to be quite a boxy top. So if you don't like it so boxy, you can take it in at the side seams. Just beware that if you make changes to the neckline, like if you take in the center front, or if you take in the side seams, you'll also have to do the same thing to the facing. If you do and you have extra fabric, I would recommend cutting a new facing that matches the length of the neckline. You would have to like shorten the pattern piece at the cut on fold side, just because it can get a little bulky if you have two seams at the center, but you can also try it out and see what happens. I mean, it's not going to be the end of the world. So if you don't have fabric, you can just make adjustments to what you have, but I'm going to try this on really quickly and see if it's fitting the way I wanted to. So this is how the top is looking on me. I might just take it in a smidge at the neckline. This fabric, it has a tiny bit of stretch. So I think it's not sitting exactly how my other tops are sitting. So I'm gonna sew the seam allowance just maybe like 1/4 to maybe 3/8 of an inch larger just at the neckline. And otherwise, I think it's good. Okay, so here is what it looks like. I think the neckline sits a lot better. I took it in about 1/4 inch. So I will show you what it looks like on the inside because fit adjustment seemed really scary to me when I started. So I'll show you what I did in case that is helpful. So here is the inside of my top, and this is the original seam line and my serger stitching obviously. And I just wanted to narrow the neckline a bit. So I took it in, I would say that's about 1/4 inch. And I did that all the way down the top. And now what I'm gonna do is just use my serger to finish and trim off this extra amount because this is quite a bit of seam allowance now. If you don't have a serger, you can just trim it and finish it with a zigzag stitch. So I just wanted to talk about fit adjustments for a quick second, but fabric can make a huge difference in how a garment fits you. Even if you're sewing the same pattern that you've sewn before that fits you well, if you use different kind of fabric, you can have a very different result. Some fabrics grow, some fabrics are stiffer, and they just feel different fit-wise. And for instance, this top, I've made it in a really heavyweight denim. And when it's really heavy, there is a lot more gaping just because of the nature of how this top sits in a more structured fabric. So that is just something to keep in mind when you're sewing and in your sewing journey. overall is that fit adjustments are super common and not something you should shy away from. And it's also great to learn what are the common fit adjustments you need to do. I know for my body, I have kind of longer arms. I also have a long torso, and I often have to adjust the crotch length of my pants. And I also have to grade between sizes because I don't fit perfectly into one size chart. But those are just some extra little tips that I wish someone had told me when I started sewing. I've also included a few pages of common fit adjustments that you might need. So if your top isn't fitting the way that you want it to, definitely check those pages out to see how you can fix them. And I always recommend making a mock-up or a toile before you start, just so that you don't waste good fabric in case the pattern doesn't fit you how you want it to. We'll stop rambling, and I'm gonna just cut this off and finish the seam, and we will keep going. So for view C and D of this top stitching is optional, but I really like how top stitching looks. And really, you can do whatever you want for top stitching. I actually should have done this before I sewed the front and back together, but I just remembered that I wanted to do it. So it's still pretty easy to access, so I'm gonna do that. And you can either sew right beside your seam on one side for top stitching. You could sew both. I'm gonna sew a line like 1/8 of an inch on either side of the seam. And I'm also going to top stitch my dart lines as well. I have a lot of this denim, so I'm just gonna cut a new facing piece so I don't have to have a seam here since I took my top in. So I'm just lining it up about 1/4 inch, how much I took off the center front, and I'm gonna cut around that. And this is my new facing piece. It's slightly shorter than this one. So this one should fit my new neckline perfectly. So now we'll just take our front and back facing pieces and line up the shoulder seams and sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we finished the lower edge of our facing. It's pressed open at the seam allowances. And now we're going to match it right sides together with the top. Our facing is now sewn, and now we're going to press the neckline up and away from the top, and also press the seam allowance in the same direction. And then we're gonna understitch the seam allowance to the facing. So we're gonna sew really close to this seam line, and we're gonna catch this seam allowance underneath. I love using my tailor's ham. I use it all the time for necklines and armholes and bust darts. It's just very helpful. So we're just gonna press this neckline away from the top. And again, seam allowance should also be facing up and away from the top. Here's what the understitching will look like. The stitch line is on the facing side and it's caught the seam allowance. Now in the instructions, I say to clip or trim the seam allowance down. You can do either. If you have a sheer fabric, then you may wish to trim it because then you won't see the little clips. But it's a very small seam allowance since we only sewed with 1/4 inch and then we understitched after. So you might not have to trim too much. Lastly, we will just press this to the inside of the top and pin it well, and then we're gonna top stitch 1 1/4 inch away all the way around the neckline. So I've pressed my facing to the inside and I have pinned it down using lots of pins. This is probably the only time you'll see me use this many pins, but it's to make sure the facing stays in place when I'm top stitching, because I'm going to be top stitching quite far from this neckline edge and the facing can get out of place really easily. So I like to use a lot of pins for this just so I don't get any puckering. I'm starting at the shoulder seam since the top stitching is going to be very visible. And I have a little marking over here for 1 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to try to keep it in line with the marking on my machine. So basically the goal with this is to keep the part that's under the foot flat, and that will kind of prevent puckering. If it's ever like this, you want to fix that before you start sewing. And I'm going pretty slow because this part is very visible, and I just want to make sure that I don't have to seam rip anything and sew it again. So as you get and here is what the top stitching looks like. I am very happy with this. It can be really tricky, so just take your time. And you can see I have my back stitches here, so there are no back stitches on the front or back neckline, and it's nice and clean. And now the last things to do are the bias binding on the armholes and the hem bands. Next, we're going to bind the armholes with bias tape. And since my fabric is a little bit thicker, I'm going to use a different fabric for the bias tape. In the instructions, I have a little guide on bias tape if you want to make it in the continuous method, or you want to cut strips and sew them together, or you can just cut it flat if you want as well, because they're not super long pieces. But I have this leftover strawberry fabric that I made into bias tape when I was making my strawberry shortcake dresses. And I have more than enough, but a good amount for the armholes. I'm gonna cut these to the right size, and then we're gonna press them in half, and then we're gonna press them in the same general shape as the armhole, and that will help us get a nicer finish when we're sewing. So we're pressing in half, wrong sides together. And this is a little different than the traditional method for applying bias tape, and this is called the French method, and I think it's just a little bit more beginner friendly, and it has a really nice finish still. So I'm just trying to get a general shape, and the raw edges are facing the same way as the top, and I'm just going to press it on top like that. And this is just to curve the bias tape a little bit. Now just kind of like mirror it on the other side. So I'm going to start at the underarm seam and leave just a bit of overhang, and we're going to clip it while it's still folded with the raw edges matching the armhole. When you get to the end, there's going to be a bit of excess. So we're just going to mark where the side seam is on the bias tape, and we're just going to mark that on both sides, like exactly where they would meet. Then we're going to unfold the tape, and we're going to place those markings together and sew our bias tape together with a little straight stitch right there, and then we're going to trim off the excess. So again, here is my tape and my armhole, and my two markings are right here. I'm going to place them right together. And I can also see my markings on the wrong side. And the tape is right sides together. We're going to sew right here. So we have our tape sewn together, and I'm just going to trim it to about 1/4 of an inch. Then you can either finger press this or press it with your iron. I'm just gonna flatten it out with my fingers and fold it back. And it will be like one continuous loop now, and we'll just pin that to the armhole again. And this is what you should have. So it will now be a continuous loop, and now we can sew the bias tape to the armhole. And we're gonna sew just 1/4 inch from the raw edge all the way around the armhole. And I like to do this with the free arm of the machine because it's easier to maneuver the armhole around it. Here is the binding sewn on. I'm just gonna trim these little loose ends, and then we're going to flip the binding away from the top, so out away from the top, and press it, and then we're going to understitch this just like we did the facing of the neckline. So again, with the seam allowance towards the binding and the binding away from the top, we're going to understitch and we're going to catch the seam allowance below the binding. And we're sewing on the side of the binding. Here's what your understitching should look like, and it should have caught the seam allowance below. Now I'm just gonna trim all of these loose threads everywhere. And again, if you have any areas that need trimming, you can trim them down a little bit, but it's gonna be a very small amount since the seam allowance was very small. So you can clip in if there are spots that are not laying nicely, but clipping just makes sure that the curve will sit nicely. And if your seam allowance is already very small, then it will automatically sit nicer. Now the last thing to do is flip this to the inside, press it, and top stitch. So I have pressed my binding to the inside of the top and clipped it in place. And now I'm going to edge stitch along this folded edge to secure it. You can do this from the right side, but I find that really tricky. So I'm going to do it from the inside because I know that my bobbin stitches look just as nice as the top stitches. So we're gonna sew from the inside. And here is how the finished armhole should look. I still have to press it, but it's really nicely finished with the bias tape, edge stitched, and you can see the stitching on the outside, and especially since I did the contrast stitching. But the most important thing is that you want to catch the very edge of this fold, because otherwise it's gonna be kind of like flopping around and messy looking. But now we just have to do the other armhole the same way, and then we will finish with the hembands. Next, we're gonna sew our hemband pieces together at the short sides, so at the side seams. And the one with one notch is the front hemband, and the one with 2 notches is the back hemband. And they're about the same length, and you also have to make sure that you've marked your notches because they look very similar. Although they look like rectangles, they are slightly curved to match the curve on the bottom of the top. So you do have to sew them the right way or they're not gonna fit together properly. So the notches are on the curved side, or I should say they're on the bottom curved side. So we're gonna place these right sides together and sew them together at the short sides with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now that we've sewn the short ends together, I've pressed the seams open. Now we're gonna press the top edge, which is the edge without the notches, and we're gonna press it 1/4 inch to the wrong side. So we're gonna do that all the way around. And again, notches are on the bottom. This is the top side, and we're gonna press it to the wrong side by 1/4 inch. So we have our top right side out and our hemband wrong side out. And we want to make sure that the notches are on the bottom side. And the front has 1 notch and the back has 2 notches. So we're going to match up our notches. So this one has the 1 notch, and we're gonna kind of slide the top inside of the hemband, hem facing, I should say. And we will match up our notches. Got 1 here, 1 here. So I have everything pinned in place, right sides together, notches and side seams matching, and we're gonna sew all the way around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Next, I'm gonna grade my seam allowance. So that's basically just cutting one of them down so it's a little bit shorter. And I'm gonna cut the top one down to 1/4 inch. And I have these special duckbill scissors that I really like for grading seams. It helps you not cut the back seam allowance. So we've graded our seam allowance. Now we're gonna flip the hemband down, and we're gonna press the seam allowance and the hem facing away from the top. So we're gonna press everything downwards. So we have pressed everything downwards, the facing and the seam allowance. They're all facing down. And now we are going to understitch again. So we're going to stitch right beside this seam line on the side of the facing and catch the seam allowance underneath. So our understitching is done. Here is what it looks like. And we're going to fold the facing to the inside of the top. And I'm going to show you from the inside. We're going to press it well, and then we're going to fold this fold down so that it hides the raw edge. And we will pin it really well again, and then edge stitch all the way around to finish off the hem. All right, I used a lot of pins again to pin this facing in place, and we're just gonna edge stitch right next to the fold at the top to secure the hem. And again, I'm gonna stitch from the inside because that's gonna give me a cleaner result, but you can top stitch from the top if you want to. And now that we've finished the hem facing, the top is done. I am really happy with how this turned out. I really love how the top stitching details came out, and I'm just gonna put it on quickly to show you how it looks. Here it is, and I think the fit is so perfect. I'm glad I took it in just a smidge at the center front. And here are all my beautiful top stitching details. I really took my time with the top stitching so it would look really nice. And I think it is perfect. Now that we're done view C, we're gonna make view A, which is the version with the drawstrings at the waist. And view A and B are pretty much the same, but view B has an elastic channel instead of the ties. So the construction is basically the same. Most of the beginning steps of view A are actually the same as view C, so I won't show every single step because I've already just shown that, but I will show you the ones that are different, which is basically just the finishing of the bottom edge of the top and the drawstrings. And for this sample, I'm going to be using this striped cotton double gauze. This is like a leftover piece that I have from making an old pattern sample. And this is from Blackbird Fabrics as well. And I think this is just going to be such a nice, light, breezy fabric for summer. I'm just going to cut it out with my projector and we'll get sewing. I'm actually going to show you how you can do a tiny hack. This pattern has center front and center back seams, but if you want to omit that, you can cut off a 1/2 inch from the center side of each of the pattern pieces, or you can just fold that back, or if you're using a projector, you can fold your fabric and just place it 1/2 inch from the edge, and that will get rid of that center seam for you. I'm going to do it on this top just to show you guys, and it also makes the sewing a little bit faster and easier. So I have all of my pieces cut out, and I did front and back on fold as I said. So here are those 2 pieces. All of my buttonholes are marked and my darts. I have 2 armhole bindings, 1 neckline binding, and these are my drawstring pieces. I did have to piece these together because I was using a very small scrap of fabric to make this, but it's totally fine if you need to do that. And you can also cut these on the cross grain. The only step that differs in the beginning is adding a little piece of woven interfacing to the wrong side of the front and back at the buttonhole areas. We just want to reinforce this area because that's where the buttonhole is being sewn, so it's on the wrong side of my fabric where my buttonhole marking is. And there are 4 buttonholes total, 2 on the front and 2 on the back. The beginning steps for all of these are all the same. So I'm just gonna quickly sew in my darts, finish the edges with my serger of the side seams and the shoulder seams, and sew those together. And then we'll come back when the steps do differ from view C. But for A, the only difference is we're also binding the neckline the same way we bound the armholes. This is what our top should look like. Our neckline and armholes are bound and the darts are sewn, and now we're just going to move on to the buttonholes. Most machines will have a buttonhole foot that looks like this, and you usually place a button in this top space here, so this slides up and down, and this basically dictates how big your buttonhole is going to be. So basically I'm just going to set this, I feel so silly doing this, it's like I'm a makeup vlogger, but my camera won't focus if I don't do that. But we're basically just going to set this space to how large we want the buttonhole to be. So the buttonhole on this pattern is about 3/4 of an inch. So I'm just going to set that on my seam gauge and then measure that on this little space on the foot. So it's pretty much like that. Now I'm just going to replace this with the foot that's on my machine, and there's also a little lever that I have to pull down on my machine to get the buttonhole to work, and then I will just select my stitch and start sewing. The foot for your machine might look different. I have a few other machines that the buttonhole foot looks quite different than this, so make sure to check your manual if you don't know how to sew a buttonhole. But most newer machines, they're like a 1-step automatic buttonhole, so once you have everything set up, you just press the pedal and go, and it will complete the whole stitch. I do recommend testing on a piece of scrap fabric first with the interfacing just to see how it sews, because buttonholes can be really finicky. And you also want to know which way the buttonhole sews, because some start from the bottom, some might start from the top. So just do a few test runs to see if they're working out correctly. If you're having problems with the fabric sucking into your machine, or like the stitches are, or the thread is like nesting on the bottom, you can also try to put a piece of tissue paper underneath while you sew, and then you'll just remove that at the end. But I'm just gonna sew all of my 4 buttonholes on now. I know that my machine sews from the bottom up, so I am going to start, and I have my markings in place, and I'm just going to set the foot down with it centered here. Get a little closer. I have centered the bottom of my marking in this little window here, and it's got these three red lines to kind of help you do that. And now I'm just going to press the pedal. So to open these buttonholes, you can either use a buttonhole chisel like I have here. Mine came with this little apple cutting board. Or you can use a seam ripper, which is more dangerous because it's easier to rip right through everything. But I'll show you my little trick with the seam ripper in a second. But basically, for the chisel, it's super easy. We're just going to place the blade in the middle and push and cut through. If you have fray check, you can use that as well. It's like a glue that you can add to stop buttonholes from fraying. But I like using a chisel because it makes a nice clean cut and you don't have to worry about cutting through your fabric. But here is my trick for other ones. So the first thing you can do is you can put a pin at the top, and that will just prevent you from ripping past that. But what I like to do also is I will put my seam ripper into the buttonhole, and then I'll just rip a little bit at a time. So I'll bring the end out, and then I know that it won't go further than I want it to. So that's the first little bit, and then I'll bring it out. And that ensures I won't go further than I want to. So here we have the top with all the bindings done, the neckline binding and both armholes. And now I'm just gonna turn this to the wrong side because that will make pressing easier. But we're just gonna create a channel for the drawstring at the bottom. And we're gonna do that by pressing up 1/4 inch first and then 3/4 of an inch. And once we do that, this buttonhole should be centered in that channel that we create. So this is the inside of the top, and we have our 1/4 inch fold and then 3/4 inch fold again to the wrong side. And then the buttonhole should be right on top of the channel. And I'm just going to pin it. And the last thing to do for the channel is to edge stitch it in place. So we're gonna edge stitch right next to this folded edge. Here is what our channel will look like from the inside. And then from the outside, your buttonholes should be pretty much centered. The last thing to do is create the drawstrings. So I have 2 long rectangles here. So we're going to press the long edges in towards the center, like so. And then we're going to fold it in half again and edge stitch it closed to create the drawstring. Again and press it. We're going to fold the short end in by 1/4 inch. Press that. And then we will fold it in half and press all the way down to create. And then press all the way down. Now we're just going to edge stitch everything closed. So making sure the short end is folded in. We'll fold everything in half and then we'll sew the short end first, so start here and then pivot and sew all the way down the rest of the drawstring. So the very last step is to insert our drawstring into the channel. So there's one at the back and one at the front. And I've already inserted the back drawstring, so I'm going to insert the front drawstring. So I've just attached a safety pin to it, and we're just going to thread it through this channel. So here is the finished top, and all you have to do is just cinch it up and tie it however you like. I love how adjustable this makes the top. You can even just tie them and keep the top loose if you want, or you can tie them as tight as you want. So here it is. I love the little bows at the sides, and I love that you can like cinch it as tight or as loose as you want. This is such a light, flowy, breathable fabric for summer, which I really, really love. That is the end of this video and the end of this sew along. I hope that this video helped you when sewing this top. And if you run into any issues or you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to send me an email or DM me on social media, and I would be more than happy to help. If you haven't gotten the pattern yet and you're interested in getting it, I'm going to link my website and my Etsy shop below in the description box. And thank you again for watching. I will see you in the next one. Bye.